welcome to the Town of Burlington fiscal year 2021 budget overview. I'm your town administrator, Paul Sagarino, and our intention here, given the unprecedented circumstances that we're dealing with in our country and in our town, we wanted to provide our residents and our town meeting members with this presentation in advance. We know that there's going to be a lot of questions, and we do welcome your questions, much more so earlier in the process this year than in previous years. We would love to hear from everybody. This presentation will not cover everybody's questions, but please do contact anybody that's participating here for further information. I'd just like to let everybody know we are here within this room. We have Superintendent Dr. Eric Conti, Chairman of our Ways and Means Committee, Roger Riggs, Assistant Town Administrator in charge of Finance, John Denizio, Whitney Haskell, our town's Budget Director, as well as our Town Assessor, Jim Doherty. So I think I have the easy part of the beginning presentation, which is the presentation we would typically give for town meeting. And moving on into the pandemic, I believe that the town was in the best financial position it's ever been in when we started this. So this is the presentation that we would have been moving forward. And then we'll get into some of the other details after we get through where we started from. So with that, I'll start with the first slide. Just so everybody is aware, the budget process for this current fiscal year upcoming started last fall. We have a guidelines meeting with elected officials, appointed officials, and members of the administration. And we try to work through what we call the town budget guidelines in terms of setting limits for spending, setting limits for taxing. And that process begins in the fall. It's a difficult process, a lot of different opinions involved. And we sort of worked through that. I think we took two sessions this year to come to an agreement. And I think one of the members who attends that meeting typically says if all parties walk away a little bit unhappy, then I think we end up with a pretty good product. So that, just to let everyone know, we started that process back in the fall. From that point on, department heads, they develop budgets with their appointing authorities and their supervisors. From there, we move on to Ways and Means, has subcommittees assigned to all departments. So departments go through a process of the Ways and Means subcommittee. Ultimately, those recommendations make it to a full Ways and Means committee meeting where all members participate. From that point, Ways and Means recommends a budget to town meeting, which is where we are right now at this point. So that's where we are in the process. From there, we end up putting together in the fall a tax rate for submittal to the Department of Revenue for approval, up until the point where our tax collector prepares the tax bills. So that's the typical process we do for a town meeting. And I can tell you from experience that there were thousands of hours put in by elected appointed officials in reviewing these budgets between the Ways and Means subcommittees, the school committee, the Board of Selectmen, the Capital Budget Committee even gets into some aspects of this, but I can assure you that there's been a ton of time spent by a lot of dedicated people in reviewing these spending requests. Next slide, please. This slide basically represents sort of the breakdown of how we spend our money within the town. Red, general government, school department in green, 36%. We have a category of budgets, which are essentially fixed costs that the town refers to as accommodated costs. Those are budgets that don't necessarily apply to one department, but sort of apply to the town as a whole. Within that category, we have a lot of really difficult budgets, health insurance, trash budget, our special ed budget. So a lot of those budgets are typically very difficult for the town to control. We don't exercise a lot of authority in determining what they are. A lot of times we're assigned a number, and that's what we have to deal with. So that is typically a very difficult part of our budget to manage, and I'm fairly confident that we had pretty good results this year in providing those numbers. Have next slide, please. Next slide represents where the town generates its revenue to fund this budget. Over 49% of our overall budgetary spending is provided by our commercial businesses and business taxes. The next largest component would be the tax burden of our residents at about 30%. So 30% of our budget is funded through residential taxes. The green category, 11%, represents local receipts. Those are some of the additional monies that the town collects: motor vehicle excise tax, meals tax, hotel taxes, water, ambulance, a variety of miscellaneous items that people pay to the town. The next category in purple is our state revenue. State revenue is a very smaller portion of our budget. We fund much more of it through taxation, and current state revenue only represents about 6% of our budget, which is not a great thing, but I guess as we're entering very difficult times, we have less risk associated with state aid because it covers a much smaller proportion of our budget. Next slide, please. This slide represents the property tax revenue. This is something we work very, very hard to try to manage. We want to continue to provide the residents with the best services, but also we always want to keep an eye on our overall tax levy increase. So the top row right there represents the last 4 years of tax levy increases. When we refer to the tax levy, that is the entire amount of property taxes between residents and businesses every year. So you can see where we've gone. The line below that represents, because we have such a large proportion of our taxes are picked up by commercial taxpayers, the tax levy increase does not translate into what a residential tax bill increases. So we have both numbers here. The bottom row indicates what the percentage resulted in from that tax levy and what we resulted with a single family tax bill increase. So you can sort of see the relationship between the tax levy and the actual impact on our average single family tax bills. Next slide, please. For the past fiscal year, our commercial tax rate was $25.54. That is 302nd lowest within the state, and that may be a little bit misleading because there's a majority of the communities in the state don't have a commercial tax rate. So what we have to do is we have to evaluate that tax rate to make sure it's appropriate, because we're in competition with other communities. We feel as though our commercial tax rate is in the ballpark of what other similar type of communities charge their businesses. And as you can see on the right-hand side, a really good story. $9.64 for the residential tax rate. That is the 37th lowest in the entire state out of 351 cities and towns. So we're very, very proud of that. We feel as though we have a very competitive commercial tax rate, but we also feel as though we were able to produce a relatively low residential tax rate for our residents because we have so many businesses here in the community. Next slide, please. This is a really interesting metric, and it's definitely something that I hope that everybody really takes time to understand, and that is the relationship between commercial and residential properties. The total assessed value of all the property in our town is 61% residential and only 37.7% commercial. Now, 37.7 commercial puts us in the upper echelon of communities in Massachusetts in terms of how much commercial value we have in our community. And here's where the relationship gets very interesting, is the numbers almost flip-flop in terms of who pays the largest share of the tax levy. So as you saw, value, 61% residential. So 61% residential ultimately ends up paying 37% of the tax levy. So there's a really good mathematical relationship there, whereas our commercial businesses pick up a very large proportion of tax revenue in the community. And just for comparison's sake, the average total tax levy is 82% residential and 18% commercial in most communities. So you can see really what the difference is between what we have here in Burlington with such a large business community where 37% of our value is made up with commercial businesses. Next slide, please. This next chart sort of represents the trend of property values and levy share. It's sort of like a running tab of what we just showed you on the last slide. It sort of shows you that relationship where residential value picks up a lesser portion of the share. In purple, we're representing the value, the residential, and in red, we're talking about the commercial values there. So you can definitely see what a benefit it is for us to have so many businesses within the community. Next slide, please. This next slide represents state aid. As I mentioned earlier, state aid covers a relatively small portion of our budget. You know, that's not great news, and a lot of that is based upon formulas that take into consideration that we have a great business community here. Again, this will come into play. A lot of communities get up to 50% of their budget through state aid, which seems like a great thing. And unfortunately, during bad times when the state is in difficulty, that really puts this in jeopardy. But for our particular case, we have budgeted, it only covers about 6% of our total budget that we receive from the Commonwealth of Mass. Next slide, please. The next category here, this is our trends in local receipts. This is another area that we do really well, and we're able to utilize these additional funds to sort of pay for a large portion of the budget, 10%, according to this slide. And again, these numbers sort of represent the collections that we receive from motor vehicle tax, water, ambulance, hotel, motel taxes, miscellaneous type revenues that the town receives. Next slide, please. Okay, the next slide represents new growth and excess capacity. So new growth is a really key economic indicator for us. And what that is increases in our new tax growth from new construction within the community. So typically that is a very good number for us. As everybody is aware, there's always, fortunately, a lot of economic activity going on, buildings being renovated, buildings being built. So that's a very good number for us. Last year, we added $3.2 million under the Proposition 2.5 formula in new growth. That is a very healthy number, and it's right up there with the past several years. So we actually had a very, very good year in terms of that. And new growth also plays into excess capacity. So what excess capacity is under Proposition 2.5, we have a tax levy limit. Burlington is one of the few communities in the state that taxes below our Proposition 2.5 taxing limitations. So we have the ability, as you can see from this chart, we are currently estimated for the current year, we're almost $13 million below what we could tax under Proposition 2.5. So that is really a great number. It's a great reserve for us. And, you know, it's another example of fiscal responsibility. We have the ability to tax to a much higher level. And I think that we have a good process in place to understand that just because we have the ability to do so, we need to still spend our money wisely. But I can tell you that 12 to $13 million in excess capacity is really an exceptional number when you look at other communities within the state. Typical community taxes right up to the maximum that they're allowed to under Proposition 2.5. We do not. Next slide, please. At this point in the presentation, I would like to turn it over to the chair of our Ways and Means Committee, Roger Riggs, to give you their perspective on the budget. Roger, don't forget to mute yourself. Unmute yourself. Thank you.
Right. Welcome. So Ways and Means has been looking at this budget since February. We've obviously, as we participated in the budget guideline meetings back in November, December. And we have been reviewing budgets incrementally since February. Ways and Means has 5 subcommittees, and one of the biggest ones is the school subcommittee that reviews the school budget in depth. We spend a lot of time looking at the changes from previous years, and this year the guideline was set at 3.5%. blended between the municipal and school budgets. A lot of the budgets, a big proportion of the budgets are related to personnel costs, and that frequently is the thing that drives the guideline. We've looked at all the budgets in detail. There, are incremental improvements here and there, but pretty much it's business as usual to provide a level of services that the residents have come to recognize as being, what they want. We overall, the town's in a very good position financially. We have 5 million or 9 million in free cash and another 9 million in the stabilization fund. And important to Ways and Means is that the town continue to operate the services that are essential to residents and the businesses: fire, police, water and sewer, trash, highways, schools. The Board of Health is particularly important at this point, and recreation, and then the Council on Aging. I'm sorry, I left something out, but there's a lot of different financial needs in the town to support the residents. As this budget goes forward, one thing to remember is that Burlington is an employer, a provider of services, and a consumer. So as a town, we contribute to the Burlington economy and to the region as a whole. Ways and Means supports this budget, and we think money will be well spent to keep the services coming. We did take into account the current conditions that require some flexibility in spending, and have had discussions with the administration about generally spending very conservatively so that as needed, we can make adjustments in the way things are done and how they're done to provide the services. So Ways and Means support the budget for FY 2020, and we look forward to talking to you and answering more questions at town meeting. Next.
Thank you very much, Roger. At this point in the presentation, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Eric Conti, our school superintendent. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. First thing I want to say is I hope everyone watching this video is well and your extended families are well. It's been an interesting time navigating this healthcare crisis. What seems like a couple years ago, as Paul stated, the budget process started in the fall with an agreement towards a guideline. Roger mentioned the guideline was a 3.5% blended. So the school committed to bringing their operating budget in at 3.75. We presented a budget to the school committee that they adopted at 3.75. And then the full Ways and Means Committee saw that budget and approved unanimously and supported unanimously the school's operating budget at 3.75. The 3.75 increase in our budget includes all contractual obligations. So we want to thank our unions. This was a contract year for us, so that was a big unknown. And we did bring in some one-year agreements after the pandemic, just to make sure that we could make our guidelines. So I wanted to make sure I thanked our unions for doing that. The budget also includes 2 new nursing positions. Felt like our nursing ratios were insufficient. And so we have 2 additional nursing positions that are included in that. All of our other costs have been level funded from last year, from fiscal 20 to fiscal 21. So we do that. Again, the budget process takes a lot of people, many hours, as everyone has mentioned already. I just want to thank Paul and John for meeting regularly. We met regularly with town, and I think the communication was greatly improved. And I don't think either of us were surprised by anything that we were doing. And I think that was really helpful. So Paul, thank you for your time. Roger, the Ways and Means, the subcommittee, the school subcommittee works countless hours. We have a very detailed budget. I think we met, I don't know, a dozen times. I think there was no question that wasn't asked or answered. And again, I appreciate their time. So please pass on our gratitude to that group. And as I said, the school budget did come in at the agreed to guideline, the operating budget. The accommodated account, as Paul mentioned, are volatile costs, largely our out-of-district special education and transportation costs. That met the financial parameters, again, that we agreed to in the fall. That budget is coming in at a 5% increase. And it's just important to say that we are projecting a 65 reimbursement on state circuit breaker. I know people have been doing this for quite a long time. Typically, the state reimburses at 75%, but we were projecting that there may be some decline in state revenue, so we were very conservative in our accommodated account projection. And even at that conservative projection, we're coming in where we had agreed to in the fall. So again, we feel this budget, with this budget, we can provide a level of schooling that people are accustomed to in Burlington. What that is exactly going to look like, we don't really know at this time, but we'll make adjustments as we get more information and as we go into the fall. As a final note of thanks again to town meeting, and there are many parents who are also members of town meeting. You're incredible partners with the school district on a regular year, I guess a normal year, if I can even use that term normal anymore. You've all been incredibly supportive of the educational process and have been great partners in the learning process since our school buildings have been closed. So again, it's just with gratitude. I just end my part of the presentation and just say thank you for doing that, and thank you for all the folks at schools who put this budget together. And I'm looking forward to town meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Conti. Next part of the presentation is really important, and I think this is the part where most of our questions will come to. But we've done a lot of thinking about, how the community should react to what's going on a national level. We're clearly not in the same revenue position that we have been in previous years. Our hotel taxes, our meals taxes are taking a hit. Clearly, there's probably going to be an impact to our state aid. Luckily, it's a smaller portion of our budget. But I just want to reiterate, we're very conservative with our budgeting, and we put a lot of thought into this, and we're going into this crisis with probably our best financial reserves in the history of the community. It's not going to save us forever, but we do feel that it should buy us some time to react to the crisis. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Assistant Town Administrator John Denizio to talk to you about our process as we moved through this budget crisis and how we would like to proceed through the budget this year in light of the pandemic that's going on. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Paul. So I'm next to talk to you about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic to the FY21 budget. I'm going to share a few slides to review where we were, outline some of the adjustments we've made, and talk a little bit about our plan moving forward. So on to the next slide. So this is just a quick reminder of what was approved in the guidelines meeting back in December before the COVID pandemic and the economic downturn that it has caused. So Paul talked a little bit about our guideline process and the budget summit that we have, and these are the results that came out of that. You can see here the revenue and expense guidelines for FY21 for our non-recurring revenues and expenses of our operating budget. On the revenue side, you can see we were budgeting local receipts and state aid at a modest increase, and that was based on our 5-year average. On the expense side, we were targeting the school and town operating budget of a blended rate of 3.5, which for this year was a 3.25 target for the town side and a 3.75 target for the school side. On the other expense category, is known as our accommodated accounts that Paul spoke about in his presentation. And those budgets are not broken down into each department, but instead budgeted on a town-wide basis. This is for things like health insurance, pension costs, debt service, and schools out of district, special ed, tuition, and transportation. The target for those accounts was somewhere between 6 and 7% increase. So this is where we were in the fall and through the winter and into March. And then we all know what happened next. The next slide. So what are the impacts of COVID on projected revenues in our FY21 budget plan? Here's a summary identifying the total budget for each of our funding categories, and it illustrates whether the category has been adjusted. As you can see, the funding categories are local receipts, state aid, tax levy, free cash, special revenue. So the operating budget is made up of the local receipts, state aid, and tax levy, and then the free cash and special revenue amounts come from whatever we decide we're spending from those accounts. So on the slide, you can see that we adjusted down the local receipts, the state aid, and the free cash numbers, and we'll get more on that in the next few slides. Next slide. The local receipts, more on that. This is where we really expect to take the biggest hit, as Paul had mentioned. We made adjustments to some of the receipts that you can see there. We adjusted occupancy tax for motels. Right now, the hotels are closed. We don't know when they're going to open or to what level they'll open. Meals tax. Right now, the restaurants are either closed or operating on takeout only. We know that they're going to be opening soon, but we don't know at what level and how quickly that will increase. Excise tax is probably not a lot of people buying cars right now. Building permits, we're pretty stagnant right now. We're hoping that comes back. Water charges are, with businesses closed, putting a big dent in our water charges for the past few months. And finally, with projecting less cash coming in, we're also projecting less investment income. So after making these adjustments, we're estimating local receipts for FY21 budget to be 16.7 million. This is level funded from last year, and it's more than a $500,000 decrease from what we had budgeted in our original projection. Paul had mentioned that we budget very conservatively, and we do that for a reason, and this is the reason. And to put it in perspective, that 16.7 million is a 0% increase, but it's actually about 27% lower than what our actuals were for FY19. That 27% is about $4.5 to $5 million. So there's a pretty good cushion in there. So we feel strongly about that. On to the next slide in state aid. What is the impact of COVID on state aid? So we made an adjustment to each of the categories of state aid. That's Chapter 70, unrestricted government, general government aid, veterans and elderly exemptions, and libraries. So for the FY21 budget, we're budgeting $10 million, which again, like local receipts, is level from where we were last year. It's a few $100,000 lower than our original budget, which we used the governor's budget for. But this one is a little more tricky to guesstimate. The projections are all over the place. Some of the experts think that the cuts could be quite severe, like 10% or something like that. That could mean $1 million for us. Some of the experts think that the state will do what they've done in the past, and they'll hold harmless some of the categories, like Chapter 70, and they'll use either federal funding to backfill, or they'll dip into the stabilization fund, the so-called rainy day fund. Either way, we're not going to know that before town meeting. The state budget will likely be set after July 1st. So our plan moving forward is to level fund the state aid, and if there's a cut that's beyond what we can handle in the budget, then that's where some spending contingencies we'll talk about in a few slides will come into play. Next slide. Use of free cash in the budget. As you know, the town has a long track record of funding one-time expenses like our pay-as-you-go capital plan with one-time revenues like free cash, or our street program with things like Chapter 90. So for this slide, talking about revenues and expenses when it comes to free cash, because they're linked. Our original proposal included just under $3.9 million of capital items and warrant articles that were requested to be funded through free cash. After our original meetings with the Board of Selectmen and the Ways and Means, all the school and town departments went back and took a harder look at each of the requests to see if there was anything that could be pushed off. Some of the capital requests are much needed and couldn't be pushed off for another year, but other articles were thoughtfully considered and came up with about $1.5 million worth of articles that were either postponed or withdrawn. The new total plan used for free cash is just under 2.4 million. Next slide. Expenses. What are the impacts of COVID on the projected expenses for the FY budget? Like the summary slide for the revenue is a summary identifying the budget totals for each of the spending categories. And it illustrates whether they have been adjusted or not. As you can see, the spending categories are town operating budget, school operating budget, the accommodated accounts, and just like on the revenue, the free cash and special revenue numbers match what the revenues are. So the operating budget, as we talked about, the blended 3.5 rate, both the town and the school came in at the guideline number. Some good news is that the accommodated number came in below what we had expected at guidelines by a little bit. That was due to favorable results in health insurance, debt service, and school tuition and transportation for out of district kids. You can see that here that the free cash was also adjusted down. We talked about that in the previous slide. And then you see at the bottom there, this leaves the spending contingency items that I talked about earlier. More on that on the next slide. What about the unknowns, and what are we going to do for contingency plans? The two biggest unknowns are, how long is this going to last, and what are we going to do if the revenue estimates change? Well, the first question, we don't have an answer yet. And the second is, where are the spending contingency items that I've been talking about come into play? We plan to create a list of contingency items that are approved in the budget, but we'll hold off on spending them at least until the fall, give us a better idea of where the effects of this global pandemic take us and what we'll have on the local economy. An example of one of these may be the OPEB payment, which we plan to request to approve within the budget, and then hold off on making that payment at least until the fall, so we know if we need to make any adjustments to the budget or not. The idea is that we would try to link any revenue changes with changes to expenses. For example, you heard me say when we were talking about state aid that it could be a 10% cut. It was $1 million. The idea would be that we would submit $1 million worth of cuts in expenses to match that as a trade-off. Next slide. Other safeguards and what other options do we have? If the cuts were more severe than we thought we could handle, there are other ways to handle that. You can see here that our reserve accounts have just over $20 million, estimated to have just over $20 million in them. Next slide. The real point we're trying to make now is, let's plan and not panic and see where we are in the fall. Let's take the time. We need more data and we need more time. Thank you for listening, and I turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate that. It really is the crux of what we're trying to do. And we've received quite a few, and I would imagine it's on a lot of people's minds, is sort of, what are the impacts on property values and how do they play into this? We have received some questions via email, and we have our town assessor here, Jim Doherty, and he's just going to run everybody through sort of how values work and sort of how they could potentially be impacted as it relates to our budget process. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Paul. My name's Jim Doherty, as Paul mentioned. I'm the Assistant Assessor Town Appraiser. I'm an employee of your Board of Assessors. On behalf of your Board of Assessors, I would like to extend their wishes that your family and yourself are healthy and safe. Want to let you know that over the last couple of months, we've been working with this financial team you see before you, working to get in front of the curve on these issues. And I'd take my hat off to the people on this call who have done just leaps and bounds to get this going, far beyond the assessor's office. I also want to recognize not only the assessor's staff, but the other staff throughout the town who has worked under challenging times, and I think really tried to fulfill all the town services they need to do. Having said that, I'd like to give a quick recap for Prop 2.5 because people generally don't get familiar with it. Paul has done a good job earlier through his slides of laying out the revenue, so I'll be very brief on this. Essentially, there is no threat to the community on the levy of a property tax. There may be collection issues, but there is no threat in terms of the town's ability to levy a real estate and personal property commitment. So how that works is basically this. In Massachusetts, you start with the previous year's levy. In Burlington's situation, it's 130 million. You get 2.5% as long as the entity, being the town, is still surviving the next year. So for this coming year, July 1st, fiscal 21, that's 133 million and change. For fiscal year 22, it's 136 million. I think most of us on this call and most people realize that probably the larger threat, not to the tax levy, but just in terms of town operations, expenditures, revenue, falls in 22, not necessarily 21. And I think Paul mentioned that earlier. To break down very quickly how that levy increase is done, as I said, you get the 2.5% and you get new growth. I'm not going to get into overrides because the town hasn't done it and we don't anticipating that being a discussion point. So for the last year, 2020, our 2.5% increase number to the levy represented $3.1 million. Our new growth number represented about $3.3 million. For this fiscal year, we will be getting about 3.25 million with our 2.5. Growth, as Paul mentioned earlier, there's been impact. The good news is we still will have pull-through and permits that took place in 19, which segues me into my valuation date and data, which is key. The valuation date for fiscal 21 is January 1st, 2020. January 1st, 2020, I think most people realize nobody was thinking about impacts, certainly to real estate valuations related to COVID or the economy or anything else. I think everything is going pretty well. So where that presents work for the town is that we're required to base our assessments on that valuation date, January 1st, 2020. Therefore, we have to rely on data and prove to the Department of Revenue our values are sound as of that date, as of historical information, i.e. calendar 19 information. We've had discussions with the DOR, which were led by Mr. Segarino. We've had the ability to reach out and suggest ways we may want to work with the Department of Revenue on certification this year, which will not only impact Burlington, but the rest of the community, the rest of the state. And I think we will get there, hopefully. For fiscal year 22, quickly, the valuation date obviously is January 1, 21. Therefore, we base it on calendar year 2000 data. Calendar year 2000 data is what we will see. Whether the economy, whether the virus, whatever the impact, we will see that, and then we will have to adjust our values accordingly. I want to leave you with one last thought as it relates to valuation and that Prop 2.5 quick summary. There is no impact in terms of the town's ability, or any town's ability, if they're solvent, to levy that tax. So we will issue that. The town can be assured for better or worse. I don't mean to be flippant about it. Finally, in the summary, I would just say this. We are going to do our best. I can tell you on behalf of the Board of Assessors, I think I can say on behalf of my dealings with the current and prior administration and selectmen that the town assessors always try to value all property certainly fairly, and most importantly, advise the selectmen to distribute it in a consistent manner. We have never been a community that pushed classification to the max. I think the goal this year would be try to continue to hold that equilibrium of how it's been distributed in the past, as Mr. Sangarino had laid out earlier in his presentation. And I think, again, for 21, it should be fine. And for 22, we have plenty of time to work on that matter. And that's really all I have to say. Thank you again for your time, and I hope everyone on a personal level is safe and healthy.
Jim, thank you very much for your thoughts. I appreciate it. I think what we're up to now is here, we want to provide everyone sort of with an opportunity to provide a closing statement. And I think the next person that in line should be John Denizio. Can you please provide us with your final thoughts on this year's budget?
Well, thank you, Paul. So I just want to put a little perspective on the adjustments to the revenues that I was speaking of earlier. And of the 154 million in revenues that's in this budget, only about 27 million of that is at risk with the local receipts and the state aid. So we talked about having a cushion of about 5 million built into there. To put that into perspective, that's almost a 20% cushion we have built in. So I think we've done a lot of the work now, and we plan to do more before the fall. But as I said before, we need more time and we need more data. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much, John. Superintendent Conti?
Thank you, Paul. Again, I just want to thank, on behalf of the school committee, the Ways and Means Subcommittee, certainly my staff for working hard, and Paul, really, the support from town has been phenomenal. So thank you. I think we have a lot of unknowns as well, but we feel like we worked hard to bring our budget in at guideline, and that whatever, as John said, whatever new data we have, we will all work together to solve those issues as we come about. So I think staying the course makes sense for us, and we'll continue to work hard to do what's best together. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Roger Riggs from Ways and Means.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I also want to thank everybody in the administration and all the boards and the committees that we've talked to in evaluating the budget. We think it's a good budget. Ongoing, Ways and Means will continue to keep on top of the issues of budgetary items as well as the state of the economy, and work with the financial team to have sort of a steady understanding and rollout of any changes that are needed to reinforce the sort of integrity of Burlington's financial condition.
Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you for the committee's help this year. You guys put in a lot of time, probably one of the hardest working boards in town, and we really appreciate your thoughtfulness and creativity and helpfulness throughout the whole process. So thank you. For my closing statement, I have a couple of thank yous as well. I'd like to thank Whitney Haskell. She does a ton of work on the budget here for us. She didn't get to talk, but she's always there for us and putting together everything we need. So I'd like to thank her. I would also like to thank all of our residents for their cooperation during this very difficult time. Everybody's just been great. I know we've had to interrupt some services, popular services and watering and things of that nature. And we're asking folks to take precautions that we've never had to do before, with keeping away from each other and wearing masks and things of that nature. And the residents, like you always do, you responded very positively, and I can't thank you all enough. I'd also like to thank our Board of Health. Their guidance through this process has been invaluable to me personally. They approach things very thoughtfully, very rationally, and they've been amazing to work with. They're putting in a ton of hours on this stuff, so I really would like to thank our Board of Health members, and our director, Susan Luminella, who I hope she gets some rest soon, because she hasn't gotten any in months. And my last thoughts on the budget I would like to provide the town. Many of you know me. I came to this job over a year ago from the finance function of the town. I'm very proud of the conservatism that we've built into our budget process. That was something that was handed off to me 15 years ago. The town's always been very thoughtful and conservative in preparing for just an emergency like this. I've never thought that we would actually have to use it on an emergency like this, but I'm very grateful for our forefathers for setting us on that path, and I was very proud to continue the conservatism in our budget. as I was the accounting officer. So I think what Mr. Denizio said is really the crux of what I think. We're prepared to make any reductions as we may need going forward. What we're asking for you folks is if you were able to pass this budget, we will reevaluate this budget in the fall and make any adjustments as necessary. What that will allow us to do and what we're looking for is more time to evaluate the data and to take proper planning. There's a huge amount of work that goes into creating a budget. And all we're asking for the town is for some more time so that we can very thoughtfully plan out if we have to make reductions, and we very well may. And, fiscal 22, the following year, it could be another difficult year for us. But all we're looking for is some time to the fall town meeting to really make thoughtful decisions. Our decisions and what we spend money on affects our residents, affects our students, it affects everybody within the community. So it's really important to us to have time to make thoughtful decisions as we go through this. And we appreciate everybody's cooperation. We're looking forward to town meeting. And however we determine if it's inside, outside, football stadium, everybody in a different room in the school. We're working on that now. So that's going to be interesting. But really, we'd just really like to thank everybody for your support throughout the year. And we're very hopeful. We know you're going to have a lot of questions on this. And if there was ever a year for you to reach out in advance of town meeting as a resident or a town meeting member to get an answer to a question, I think that we would all appreciate that. We would certainly want to minimize unnecessary questions once we get to town meeting because of the circumstances. So we will be trying different ways to communicate with the community, to solicit questions. Hopefully, we intend to do a question and answer Google document for questions that are asked, so all town meeting members and residents can access that and hopefully cover some of the material. We're also, we'll be holding town meeting information systems, town meeting information meetings. Those are typically used to be done in person, but we'll be trying to do those virtually. We'll be inviting everybody, town meeting members and residents, to please join those sessions and ask your questions and contact individual departments, contact myself, Eric, John, Roger, Jim, whoever you have a question on. We would love to answer your question before town meeting. So if there's any thing that could come out of this little video, hopefully it is that we really want your questions in advance, and we want to provide you with the answers in advance and distribute that to as many of our residents as possible. So thank you very much. Thank you for BCAT for helping us with the recording of this. And thank you all for joining me, and appreciate all of your input.